In today's story, you're probably going to have that moment where you go, okay, I know exactly what this is, and then you're going to realize you don't. This one is bizarre, in a quiet, domestic way. It's London, 1910. A fading marriage, a charming performer of a wife, a painfully ordinary doctor, and a young assistant who suddenly becomes far more visible than she should be. Then one person disappears, the story gets rewritten in public, and the authorities start pulling on a thread that feels simple at first, until it turns into something that still doesn't sit right a century later. So the question is, what are they really chasing? The message went out as a handful of clipped words, no more dramatic than a receipt, yet it carried the weight of a hanging. Captain Henry Kendall stood with the newspaper folded in his hand as if it were a map and he'd finally found the coastline. The Atlantic air tasted of iron and coal smoke. Somewhere below, the Montrose's engines kept their steady, indifferent pulse, and the deck timbers gave small, tired groans underfoot, like the ship was speaking in its sleep. "Are you certain?" he asked. The young wireless man didn't look up right away. He didn't want to be the one who was wrong about this. No one wanted to be wrong about this. Kendall watched the horizon as if the sky might change its mind. He thought of the man he'd seen at meals. Quiet, careful, almost too polite. He thought of the boy at his side, too pale for a boy, too watchful, with the stiff posture of someone wearing a borrowed body. Kendall had noticed the hands first. He always noticed hands. That's how you learn who people are, what they cannot stop doing. The telegraphist's fingers hovered over the key. Kendall imagined the message crossing the ocean, the way a rumor crosses a city. Quick, invisible, impossible to recall once it's out. "Send it," he said softly, and then, almost under his breath, added, "God forgive me if I'm wrong." The man began to tap, and far away in Liverpool, men in plain coats would read those taps like footprints in fresh snow. Not because anyone had seen a murder, not because anyone had found a body, but because a woman had vanished, and a story about her had changed too many times. And because sometimes, in the life of a case, the most damning thing isn't what you did. It's what you ran from. On the night of January 31st, 1910, a small dinner party unfolded in North London like a scene that wanted to be remembered. Hilldrop Crescent was quiet in the way some streets are quiet. Not peaceful, exactly, but watchful. The houses stood close together, their windows like darkened eyes. Behind one of those windows, in a neat sitting room lit warmly against the winter, 4 people sat with cards in their hands and the comfortable, temporary illusion of friendship. Dr. Hawley Harvey Crippen sat on the sofa, shoulders slightly rounded, as if he were always preparing to apologize for taking up space. His glasses made his eyes seem larger than they were, giving him the perpetual look of someone caught mid-surprise. He was not an imposing man. He had the body language of a person used to being spoken over. Across from him, Belle Elmore, Cora Turner when the paperwork mattered, rested her elbows on the table with a casual ownership of the room. She wore a flowing evening dress, pink and extravagant, the kind of garment that didn't just clothe you, but announced you. Belle didn't enter rooms. Rooms happened around her. Paul and Clara, friends of Belle's, theater people, accustomed to performances and temperaments, sat with that amused readiness performers have when they're among their own. They'd come to eat, to gossip, to play whist, to let the night be what it always was. The game had barely found its rhythm before Belle placed her cards down with decisive grace. "Wait," she said, already smiling, already standing. Crippen felt it before it happened. like a familiar ache. His fingers tightened on the cards. He made a small gesture, a plea disguised as politeness. "Belle," he murmured, soft enough to be private, "perhaps we should—" She waved him off without even looking at him. It wasn't cruelty in the theatrical sense. No dramatic slap, no grand insult. It was something quieter and more instructive. Dismissal. The kind that tells you your voice doesn't matter here. Crippen leaned back. He exhaled. He let his hands relax in his lap the way someone does when they've lost an argument they didn't even get to have. Belle began to tell a story. At first it sounded like one of her usual anecdotes. An acquaintance, a misunderstanding, a little laugh at someone else's expense. But the story swelled and changed shape as she spoke. It stopped being a story and became a performance. She moved as she talked, turned the room into a stage. Her hands painted the air. She shifted voices. She found a little melody in her own lines, and then, without warning, without apology, she was singing. Not beautifully, not perfectly, but with conviction, with that careless courage of people who expect applause. She started a peculiar little dance, a flourish of skirt and shoulder, improvising her own play in real time. Paul and Clara watched, entranced. Their smiles grew wide. They were generous with their attention because they understood her language. They knew what it meant to be hungry for an audience. Crippen watched too, but his face didn't follow their delight. There was something in him, part resentment, part exhaustion, part something older, that simply refused to rise to the surface, not because he didn't feel it, because he had trained himself over years not to show it. The applause came when she finished, loud and sincere. Belle accepted it like tribute. She giggled, sat, and gave a pretty little thank you, as if the room had been built for her gratitude. Crippen glanced at the clock. He looked at the cards. He looked at the guests, already shifting in their chairs with that subtle readiness to leave. He realized, with the sinking disappointment of a man whose small hopes are routinely outvoted, that the whist game was never going to happen. The evening's remaining minutes were swallowed by Belle's performance. The night was now about leaving properly, about the carriage, about doing the right thing in the right way so Belle could continue to feel admired even as the guests departed. "Go on," Belle said, already in command again. "Fetch them a proper carriage." He rose. "Yes," he said, and it sounded like agreement. It was also surrender. As he moved toward the front door, Belle called after him, bright and sharp, "And don't get one of those cheap ones. A nice one." Crippen paused, one hand on the handle, as if he might turn back and say what he really thought. He did not. He stepped into the cold. Outside, London's winter carried a dampness that seeped into the bones. The street was not empty, but it wasn't generous either. Carriages passed now and then, mostly the rattling kind, the working kind, functional, plain, loud. He walked and walked, glancing up and down, scanning for the polished vehicle Belle would approve of. It took longer than he wanted to admit. An hour, give or take, long enough for irritation to sour into embarrassment. People looked at him the way passers-by look at a man searching for something, as if he's lost more than an object. In the end, he hailed what he could find. It was a rickety carriage. It wasn't elegant. It wasn't nice. It was what the street offered. He returned. Belle came down the steps with the guests, all charm in front of them. But the moment she saw the carriage, her expression changed into something cold and immediate. Clara and Paul didn't seem to mind. They climbed in. They said their goodbyes. They went. Crippen watched the carriage disappear down the street, and in the sudden quiet that followed, he felt something like relief until he turned back toward the house. Belle was already inside. He entered to find her planted in the living room with her arms folded, still dressed in her finery, still illuminated by the lamplight like an actress waiting for her cue. Her anger didn't explode. It poured. She spoke of the carriage, of the hour he'd wasted, of the insult he'd committed by bringing her something cheap. Then she widened her scope. The dinner party, in her mind, was now a failure. Not because of her indulgent performance, because of him. "You sat there like a corpse," she said. "You didn't contribute. You didn't even clap properly." Crippen swallowed. He kept his eyes down the way a man does when he knows the storm will pass faster if he doesn't give it a tree to uproot. Belle watched him, irritated by the calmness itself. She wanted a reaction. She wanted proof she could still move him. When she didn't get it, she crossed to the mantel and took up a frame photograph, an image she kept shamelessly displayed as if daring him to protest. A handsome prizefighter stared out from the frame, strong jaw, confident eyes, the kind of man who looked like he could take up space without apologizing for it. Belle held the photo out like a weapon. "I can have any man I want," she said. "Look at him. I could have him again if I chose. I don't need you." Crippen blinked behind his thick lenses. He did not flinch. Belle's mouth tightened. Then she said it. The line she'd used before. A threat that always sounded final until it wasn't. "I'm leaving you tomorrow." Crippen didn't answer. He didn't even nod. If anything, there was a small, quiet movement inside him that might have been hope, not because he wanted her to leave out of malice, because the idea of being free, without scandal, without him having to be the one to end it, had the shape of a miracle. Belle kept talking. The words kept coming. She could rant for hours if the room allowed it. At some point, Crippen did something that should have been impossible in that atmosphere. He spoke. "Belle," he said, gentle, as if asking a favor, "would you like some whiskey?" It was absurd in the middle of a fight. That was why it worked. Belle paused, suspicious, as if he'd changed the rules of their marriage without asking. Her eyes narrowed. Then, oddly, her shoulders eased. "Yes," she said, as if granting him a new role. "Yes, I will." Crippen went to the liquor cabinet, hands steady enough that no one would suspect what the steadiness meant. He poured 2 drinks, a domestic gesture, a small peace offering. A point in the evening where, if you were looking from the outside, you might say, they're just a miserable couple, that's all. And if you believed that, you would be like almost everyone who knew them. 2 days later, the Music Hall Ladies Guild gathered for a meeting in London, and Belle, its treasurer, its loudest presence, wasn't there. The women sat waiting, glancing at the clock, exchanging that low, irritated murmur reserved for someone who is always late, but always forgiven because she's entertaining. Belle didn't arrive. A knock came at the door. When it opened, a young woman stood there, breathless and flushed with urgency. Ethel Lenave, Dr. Crippen's assistant. She held a letter and a package in her hands, as if she'd run through the city with them pressed to her chest. "I'm here on behalf of Dr. Crippen," she said. "And Belle." Her voice was controlled, but her eyes were bright in a way that suggested she hadn't slept properly. The women let her in. She placed the letter and package on the table, turned and left without lingering, as if lingering might create questions. After she was gone, the guild members stared at each other. Then one of them opened the letter. It was written by Dr. Crippen. He explained, smoothly, politely, that Belle had been called back to America because a family member had fallen ill. Belle would be away for months. He'd sent the checkbook and ledger so the guild could appoint a temporary treasurer in her absence. The package contained exactly that. the checkbook, the ledger, the tidy little skeleton of Belle's roll. The women sat with the paper in their hands, confused in a way that felt almost ungrateful. It seemed serious. It sounded plausible. And yet, Belle hadn't said goodbye. Belle hadn't written herself. Belle hadn't made a performance of leaving, which would have been more like her. Still, the Guild did what institutions do when faced with uncertainty. They adapted. They hired someone temporarily. They waited. Weeks passed. Then came the Guild's annual ball. It was one of those events that carried the illusion of glamour, even when everyone was tired beneath it. Lights, music, laughter, and organized brightness. Belle's absence hung over the room like a missing ornament. She was the kind of person whose absence felt like a silence you could hear. Dr. Crippen arrived, and he did not arrive alone. On his arm was Ethel and Eve, not discreetly, not as a vague acquaintance, as a companion. Clara watched them move across the floor, watched them sway and dance, and felt a hot disbelief rise up in her chest. It was so brazen it seemed almost insane. Crippen openly parading his assistant in front of Belle's friends as if Belle had never existed, as if marriage was a costume you could remove when the audience changed. The women of the Guild gathered later, outraged, whispering in sharp little clusters. Whatever had happened to Belle, this was wrong. They decided Crippen would be excluded from their circles until Belle could be spoken to, until Belle could explain what kind of arrangement this was, if any. But Belle never wrote. Belle never returned. And on March 20th, 1910, Dr. Crippen told people he had received terrible news. Belle, he said, had fallen ill in America. Belle, he said, had died. Grief in that world was not only sorrow, it was also suspicion, because grief is a story, and stories can be shaped. Clara and the others did not accept it cleanly. They couldn't. The disgust they'd felt at the ball curdled into something sharper, colder, the sense that the man who looked harmless might not be harmless at all. They went to the police. At first, the police were unmoved. There was no obvious crime. A woman gone to America, a report of illness, a claim of death. Plenty of people died far away. Plenty of marriages were unfaithful without becoming violent. But Belle's friends pressed. And after months of pressure, Scotland Yard assigned a seasoned hand, Chief Inspector Walter Dew. Dew had spent decades in the work. He had the face of a man who had learned to keep his reactions private. He'd been part of the machinery of London's darker history, one of those names that carried quiet weight among policemen. If Dew took an interest, it meant the polite explanations had run out. On July 8, 1910, Dew went to Hilldrop Crescent. He expected a story. He expected the American relative explanation, the California cremation, the neat finality. Dr. Crippen greeted him with politeness that bordered on trembling. They sat. Dew asked his basic questions first. Dates, names, letters, arrangements. Crippen answered, but his answers had edges. Not sharp edges, soft ones, the kind that snag on the truth. There was an awkwardness to him, an embarrassment that seemed too large for the situation. Dew noticed it and did not interrupt it. A good interrogator lets discomfort do its own work. At some point, Crippen stopped. He put his head in his hands as if physically trying to hold himself together. Then he removed his glasses. He placed them carefully on the table like a man placing down something heavy. He looked up at Dew with bare eyes, smaller now, more human. "I should tell you the truth," he said. Dew didn't move. "Belle isn't dead." The sentence sat in the room like a sudden draft. Crippen explained, slowly, almost pleading to be understood. that the morning after that dinner party, Belle had vanished. Her things were gone. She had left in the night without telling him where she'd gone. He said he lied because he feared scandal. He said Belle was beloved by everyone else, and he didn't want her to be dragged through gossip, didn't want himself to be pitied, didn't want their marriage's ugliness to become public entertainment. He insisted, quietly, firmly, that he had not harmed her. She left of her own accord, he said. She threatened it often. This time, she simply did it. Dew watched him, listened to the shame in his voice, the way it seemed to hollow him out. Crippen looked like a man confessing to cowardice rather than crime. Then Crippen spoke of Ethel. He admitted he had been in love with his assistant for a long time. With Belle gone, he had allowed himself to be open about it. He knew how it looked. He insisted again. He wasn't cheating on a living wife. He was living in the wreckage of a marriage that had ended without formalities. Dew had seen liars. Crippen didn't feel like one. At least not in the way Dew was used to. He felt like a man ashamed of being weak. Still, Dew did his work. He asked to search the house. Crippen agreed too quickly, too generously, like a man desperate to be believed. Dew and his men searched. They found nothing. No sign of violence, no obvious concealment. Afterward, Dew told Crippen, carefully, that he believed his account for now. But there was a condition, spoken with the quiet authority of a man who knew how quickly truth can evaporate. They needed Belle. They needed her to contact police, to confirm she was alive, to put the matter to rest. Dew and Crippen drafted a newspaper notice intended for American papers, a message that sounded like a plea and a warning disguised as bureaucracy. Belle, if you see this, contact the police in London. Dew left Hilldrop Crescent thinking he'd solved a messy domestic riddle. 5 days later, he returned. The house was empty. Dr. Crippen was gone. Ethel Leneve was gone. And suddenly, all the harmlessness Dew had allowed himself to believe curdled into humiliation. Because innocent people do not disappear the moment they're asked to bring the missing woman back into the light. Dew set the manhunt in motion. Descriptions went out, notices were circulated, ports were watched, and Dew returned to Hilldrop Crescent with a different kind of attention. Not the courteous search of a missing person inquiry, but the ruthless search of a betrayed detective. They tore through the house, mattresses overturned, drawers emptied, closets open. The home's tidy domestic surface was stripped down to its bones. Still nothing. Then Dew went down into the basement. The basement had that particular smell of London homes, dampness, coal dust, old brick. Men were already down there searching, irritated by the sense of futility. Dew descended the steps, feeling the heat of being duped. Anger can sharpen your senses. It can also make you reckless. He reached the bottom and looked around, and then he noticed the bricks near the fireplace. They were wrong. Too new. Too carefully placed. Not part of the tired, ordinary architecture of the basement. A small patch of tidiness in a room that otherwise made no effort to look respectable. He took a poker and tapped at the bricks. Solid. 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 Then, near the center, a hollow note. It was the smallest sound in the world, and it changed everything. Dew's pulse quickened. He called his men. They pulled up the bricks. Underneath was a layer of clay, smooth and deliberate, like someone had tried to seal something in place. A shovel was brought. Dew took the first scoop. A smell rose up, thick, rancid, unmistakably human in a way that made the body recognize danger before the mind could label it. Men recoiled, choking, swearing, some turning away to retch. The basement suddenly felt too small for air. They returned with handkerchiefs pressed over mouths and noses, forced themselves back into that corner, as if bravery could be measured in how long you could endure what the earth was trying to reject. They dug. What they found was not a whole body, not a neat piece of evidence, not anything that would allow grief to have a face. It was fragments, remains arranged in the worst possible way. Enough to suggest an act, not enough to provide a clean certainty. They could not, from what lay in that clay, point to an easy identification. But the pit held clues: hair that resembled Belle's, fabric, a piece of skin with a distinct mark that matched descriptions of Belle's body. The sort of detail that doesn't feel important until it becomes the only thing left to hold on to. There were also chemical traces consistent with a drug Crippen had been handling in the weeks before Belle vanished, a sedative used in medicine at the time. It wasn't a confession, but it was a whisper from the dark. Dew climbed back up the basement steps with the sick certainty that his instinct had been right all along. Now the story belonged to the public. Newspapers howled. The city devoured the details. The polite facade of Hilldrop Crescent cracked open and showed its teeth. And out in the world, already out in the world, Crippen and Ethel were moving under assumed names, trying to become strangers. They made for Antwerp. They boarded the Montrose on July 20th, bound for Canada. Ethel wore a boy's clothing. Her hair was cut. She kept her head down. Crippen played the role of father with the stiff, unnatural precision of a man who knows he's performing for his life. They might have made it. They might have slipped into the anonymity of a new continent. But a ship is a small world, and captains notice what doesn't fit. Captain Kendall saw the newspaper. He saw the faces. He saw the little mannerisms, the careful avoidance, the tension in the boy's posture. The way Crippen looked at the deck, not like a traveler, but like a man counting the minutes. Before the Montrose steamed beyond the reach of wireless transmission, Kendall had his man send the telegram to British authorities. Dew did not wait. He boarded a faster ship, Laurentic, and crossed the Atlantic like a man chasing his own mistake. He reached Quebec before the Montrose. And on July 31st, as the Montrose entered the St. Lawrence River, Dew came aboard disguised as a pilot. Crippen saw him and knew instantly that the ocean had betrayed him. There are moments when a person understands their life has ended, even before the law speaks it aloud. Crippen's face, witnesses would later say, changed in a way that suggested the last of his hope had been pulled out by the roots. They arrested him. They arrested Ethel. They brought them back. In court, Crippen would be tried and convicted of murdering his wife. Ethel and Eve would be acquitted of participation. And Dr. Hawley Harvey Crippen would be hanged at Pentonville Prison in November 1910, his name fixed forever to a story that seemed, for a century, like one of those grim moral tales. The meek man, the unfaithful wife, the mistress, the cellar, the run. A tidy shape if you didn't look too closely. But people did look closely, because even then the case had odd angles that didn't sit right with the mind. Why remove so much and leave so little? Why conceal fragments beneath a basement floor instead of destroying everything if destruction was the goal? Why choose poison, a method that can mimic illness, only to follow it with acts that would guarantee suspicion? Questions like that don't always matter in court. Courts like clean lines. They like a story with an ending. But the questions stayed alive, passed from book to book, from whisper to whisper, because something in them felt unfinished. Then, nearly 100 years later, the case opened its eyes again. In the early 2000s, tissue preserved from the Hildrop Crescent investigation still existed in a collection, kept, cataloged, the way institutions keep relics of old horrors. Forensic science had changed the world. It had changed certainty itself. A forensic scientist, Dr. David Foran at Michigan State University, re-examined the evidence with tools that didn't exist in 1910. He compared DNA from the preserved tissue to living relatives from Bell's family line. The result was not ambiguous. It did not offer the comfort of maybe. It said, "This tissue does not belong to Bell Elmore." And then came the second blow, the one that made people sit back as if the past had moved beneath them. The remains were consistent with a male, not Bell, not even female, a male body placed beneath Dr. Crippen's basement floor, carrying the weight of a century of assumptions, which meant that somewhere inside the story everyone thought they knew, there was a missing person no one had named. And if the body wasn't Bell's, then where was Bell? And why did Dr. Crippen run like a guilty man? And why did the evidence in the cellar point so convincingly to her, if it wasn't her at all? The hardest part wasn't the idea that the courts could be wrong. History is full of that. The hardest part was the shape of the residue left behind, the unresolved thing that refused to die neatly. Bell Elmore vanished from London in 1910 and was never conclusively found. And Dr. Hawley Harvey Crippen went to the gallows with the world certain it understood what he had done. A century later, certainty cracked, not into clarity, into something worse. Because if the story was wrong, it wasn't wrong in a way that gave answers. It was wrong in a way that created a second shadow, a second victim, and an ending that still feels even now like a message tapped out into darkness, crossing water, crossing time, arriving too late to save the man it was meant to condemn. This was Midnight Horror Society, dark curiosity for sleep. Until your next midnight session, sleep well.